image comes to mind when you think about God's creation? Do you think big, like a forest, maybe stars or galaxies? What about weather events? Now, what about something small like a beetle or a butterfly? We invite you to think about God's creation from many different angles. Try thinking of yourself as a small insect pollinating a beautiful flower. How does that feel? And now think of yourself as a huge oak tree, giving shelter to birds and animals and shade to friends on a picnic. How cool is that? And that little journey is just a glimpse into the impetus for this video series, the feeling of interconnectedness with all other life forms on Mother Earth. We're calling this video series Connected in God's Creation, and we're exploring ways of responding to God's call to care for creation. We acknowledge the mess we have made and allowed to continue for far too long, and we need to be part of the solution. If you'd like to record your thoughts as you listen to this material, please feel free to pause the video and get something to take notes with. Welcome back. This series was created by Lutherans and Episcopalians in the Delaware and Maryland area who are eager to share the vision, the wisdom, and the call to action that is the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter was crafted by visionaries with input from thousands of individuals and organizations around the world almost 22 years ago. This is a picture of it on my kitchen counter. And while it is only 4 pages long, albeit very small font, it is huge in its intent. It was written for the collective we. It is a secular document, but it is in lockstep with the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and all of Jesus Christ's teachings. And it has been endorsed by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Episcopal Church, and many, many other religions around the world. The Earth Charter's goal is to inspire a sense of responsibility for all beings, regardless of their importance to humans, for creatures now and importantly, in the future. The Earth Charter is intended for all individuals, organizations, both for-profit and non-profit, and governments. There's no one left out of its intentions. It offers a recipe for successful living on Mother Earth. It reminds humans that while we are not more important than trees or waterways or kangaroos or butterflies, we do have an outsized impact on other life forms. And our ways need to change if humans are going to exist for longer than just a few more generations. The Earth Charter has 61 objectives, which are grouped into 16 principles and further grouped into 4 pillars, which we will list now. Number 1, we must respect and care for all plants, animals, and people. Number 2, we must strive for ecological integrity. Number 3, we need social and economic justice. And number 4, we have an imperative to strive for democracy, nonviolence, and peace. This video will cover aspects of the 4th pillar, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. Please enjoy.
Hey everyone, my name is Alan Yarborough, and I'm the Church Relations Officer with the Episcopal Church Office of Government Relations based in DC, but a part of the church-wide staff or the presiding bishop staff. This office has been a part of the church since the late 70s, tasked with representing the church's policy positions to the US federal government. Those policy positions come from General Convention and Executive Council. For those who know the church well, those are our governing and legislative bodies of the church, which means we do not come up with those policies. We are just tasked with implementing them. We're also tasked with making sure that Episcopalians have what they need, the tools, the understanding, the direction to do this work themselves. And a key piece of that, we believe, is the ability to engage in conversation with one another. So I'll be with you today through this program, exploring the concept of civil discourse and working together with you on how we can continue to build our individual and our communal capacities to do it. So I want to introduce a simple definition in this introduction, the definition of civil discourse, and then place it in various contexts. I think you'll find that throughout our time together, that this practice fits well within the democracy, nonviolence, and peace section of the Earth Charter, particularly in how that charter stresses democratic engagement, integrating values, education, treating each other with respect, and promoting nonviolence. So first, in the context of civility, what is civil discourse? I hear people throw around that term or those two terms fairly commonly, interchangeably with one another. And I really think we need to be more specific by what we mean. We mean civil discourse is not the same thing as civility. Civility is a larger tool, a larger context that describes our interactions with one another. But civil discourse, rather, is a particular tool for particular circumstances. And we define that tool as conversation to enhance understanding. That's it. 4 words, conversation to enhance understanding. And this amounts to a basic charge to lean in close to one another. Absent from this definition, a charge to agree, a charge to persuade, a charge to be quiet and just to be patient. Civil discourse is not saying to simply be polite, nor is it the same as civility, which is sort of more fraught and may describe our behavior and may have various interpretations depending on who we are and what we are seeing. So I would distill the practice of civil discourse to conversation to enhance understanding. May translate that as building capacity for curiosity, which some may call listening, and speaking with humility, but with conviction. So civil discourse in the context of other political engagement. We can talk about civil discourse as a tool, and like any tool, it's not always appropriate for every situation. Also, like any tool, it may grow dull, or our ability to use it may weaken if we're not engaging with it often enough. So there are other legitimate and even peaceful tools for political engagement. Protesting, preaching, writing an op-ed, civil disobedience even. These are not antithetical to civil discourse, but they are different. Moments when these tools are being used may not be the most fruitful for civil discourse, and vice versa. Would a carpenter try to hammer a nail into a piece of wood while at the same time also cut it with a saw? Would you sand the wood after you painted it? Next, civil discourse in the context of the church. I think it is core to our relationship building, to the connections we are called to build and embody, and to our call to engage across difference. It's critical to seeing God in other people. Political engagement, the practice of decision-making together, including in the public policy space with our government, is, I believe, a part of our engagement with our faith, and civil discourse can help us do that. Finally, civil discourse in the context of ourselves and our own history. Identity and experience shape our engagement with one another, how we hear one another, and how we may be heard. And I think it also impacts our respective levels of responsibility when it comes to discussing a topic. In other words, perhaps men should be discussing violence against women more than women should, or that white people should be talking about racism more with other white people. In this sense, to me, there seems to be an individual dynamic of civil discourse where we hone our particular capacities for engagement with one another, but also a collective dynamic where we may need to consider the communal benefits and obligations to seeking out conversations with others on particular topics. So for this program, we will explore civil discourse in one section about inward development and 2 sections about outward application. So after that introduction, I want to do a brief learning section with you that builds upon what I've already introduced. And this gets to that inward development piece. So with our civil discourse curriculum, we frame what we call tenets of civil discourse as a list of guidelines, things to follow, aspects that we should be using or applying to our relationships. And these are tenets that we may be familiar with, things that you may have done when you're in a group setting, in a group discussion, where you might establish norms of engagement. Typically, in person, right, we would have a moment ahead of time. What are the ground rules for our engagement today? Write them down on a piece of paper. Publicly, we discuss them. Does anyone else have anything else to add? And we may agree to follow those. That's essentially what we're talking about. And our list of tenets that we use for civil discourse actually comes from the Episcopal Youth Event. That's an event every 3 years, roughly, that brings together over 1,000 youth across the church, together with bishops, with other leaders and clergy, all for the big, really fun event. And one of the requirements for attending EYE is to adhere to this list of tenets. So there's something elementary to them in a way, in that these are something that we may teach our kids, that we want to instill in our kids, both at home through our education. But we find, I think, as we grow older, as we become adults, that they're actually incredibly hard to implement. So there's something basic about them, but they're very difficult to actually go through. So what are the tenets? Respect, listen deeply, speak for yourself, try to understand, share talk time, speak with humility, gratitude, suspend judgment, disagree and love, practice forgiveness, and finally, pay attention to your thoughts and feelings. So we try to follow these tenets individually, our inward capacity. We try to work on these. And it may be the case that some of us are better at some of these than others. And having that awareness within our communities of what each of us are good at, and engaging with each other with that understanding, can help improve our conversations with one another. So perhaps I'm great at suspending judgment, but if someone wrongs me, maybe I struggle with practicing forgiveness. Maybe you have the opposite. So how can we both be aware of that and leverage that to move our conversation forward, to move our relationship forward, to move our work in the world forward together? I also want to share 3 additional quick points on this tenet section, this inward capacity section. First is that all issues, we're talking about civil discourse in the context of political conversation, all issues do not have to be fully discussed in one sitting. It is okay to walk away. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to recognize when we may be tired, even if the topics that we're discussing have a sense of urgency about them for ourselves, for our loved ones, for others that we care about. Try to stay focused on one topic at a time. It is certainly true that intersectionality is a thing. It's a real dynamic. We've got to see how issues connect with one another, how migration is influenced by climate change. But we can't let ourselves deviate too quickly without going into the necessary details to problem solve together, to find solutions together to the issues that we're discussing. And third, if the tenets are not upheld, pursuit of civil discourse is unproductive. Part of this inward capacity of civil discourse is following these tenets. And so if we're not really doing civil discourse. And so conversation in such cases should be terminated. These 3 points can work together. Maybe we're getting tired because we've been talking for too long. Maybe we need to take a break, step away, have a conversation with a different person. If the tenets are not upheld, the pursuit of civil discourse is unproductive and should be terminated. Look forward to seeing you in the next section. So in this next learning section on civil discourse, conversation to enhance understanding, I want to emphasize that civil discourse is an approach that's applicable across all issues of oppression and injustice, across any social justice matter, and it can be helpful at any level. So I mentioned I'm with the Office of Government Relations. We work with the US federal government primarily, but this practice is useful at the state and local level as well. It's also useful not just in policy, but within church outreach committees, for example. Right? So say an outreach committee has a limited budget of $10,000 to allocate in a year. Say this year they decide to put all $10,000 toward a free clinic, but not the community garden. I don't think one should conclude that they don't care about food and those who are hungry. That is just how they've decided to allocate it. But that process comes through a series of discussions that civil discourse can serve just as much as conversations about our national politics. So we must first keep in mind when applying this to each other and the outside world that there are many approaches, there are many ways to come at civil dialogue. There are many places to start, many issues to discuss. We may have different levels of understanding and education about a topic, but ultimately it's about that type of conversation to enhance our understanding about one another, about what we see, about our understanding, about our experiences and our identity. So what must we do sort of first in this outward application of civil discourse? I believe it's important to keep in mind that we must begin our conversations from a place of values. We should start with the values before jumping into partisan talking points, because I think it can help us to see that we have more in common with one another than we may initially realize. If we do that, we may feel a stronger bond with one another. We may sympathize with someone in a different way. We may ask questions in a different way, pursuing a line of curiosity that we might not have otherwise, were we to start our conversation from a partisan place. And I think in that, it can open up this sort of sacred space for dialogue, this sacred space for debate, maybe, where we can be more creative in our problem solving. I'll also add that most disagreement occurs not between people with different sets of values, but with those who rank them differently. In other words, they may have a weight of one value that's different than the weight that I would assign to it. Their top 5 may be my 5 through 10, and my top 5 may be their 5 through 10. Or there may be disagreement on how to fulfill the values, or even navigating situations where fulfilling values are in conflict with one another. I can provide an example. Let's say that we're looking at addressing environmental concerns, and we want to, this is not a church policy, but we want to address carbon emissions through a carbon tax on vehicle miles driven. This may be helpful if we're looking at and prioritizing the value of environmental stewardship and care of creation. But as a policy implementing that, at least in the short term, it could disproportionately impact people of color and poor parts of our population who may lack access to public transportation and may rely more on a car to get to work and go about their daily lives. So if we also value racial reconciliation and we also value caring for the poor, suddenly the policy proposals or the way forward seems to put our values in conflict with one another. So how can we work together? How can we dialogue together to navigate such situations? So finally, we've been distilling civil discourse as conversation to enhance understanding. We've looked at civil discourse in the context of civility, in the context of our identity and experiences, and in the context of the church. We acknowledged that there are a certain number of tenets that we should be following, but that they're difficult, and that if they're not followed, we should walk away from a conversation, and that that's okay to do. We also talked about beginning our conversations with values, and that often disagreement doesn't happen because we have different values necessarily, but we may weight them differently. We may prioritize certain values over others. And that's where disagreement can come in, where we disagree on how to implement those values. So I want to add another layer, and hopefully it's not too discouraging, on this outward application of civil discourse, which I really share just to enhance the need to build our communal capacity for civil discourse and how it can serve us in the vast majority of ways. So first, policymaking is complex. It's a difficult, hard process. I use the example of an outreach committee. I don't know how many of you may have served on an outreach committee before, but I find those conversations can be very difficult because we each care about the ministries that we are engaged in. We each care about addressing the problems in our communities, but sometimes our resources and our capacity are limited, or they're positioned in a particular way where we may be able to help one issue but not address another as effectively. Similar things happen at the state, local, the state, the national level as well. And policy is difficult or complex in both development and an outcome. And I want to provide a couple of examples. First, in development. So I lived and worked for a couple of years in Haiti in a town called Kanj. It's in the Central Plateau, it's inland, it's away from the sea, but it is next to a body of water. It's a lake that was formed by a hydroelectric dam that was created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in partnership with the Haitian government decades ago. When the dam was constructed, it flooded a valley that was relatively agriculturally fertile. It was somewhat flat. People lived there and had their land. They lived reasonably well, especially considering the area around it. But when it flooded, they lost that land. They had to flee to the mountaintops where they established the town Kanj along with other communities. And those areas are not as fruitful, not as productive for agriculture. And they are now physically 900 vertical feet above a clean water source. So from the perspective of the town of Kanj, and the people that live around that lake who were not really compensated for the loss of their land, the policy that led to implementing that dam was a bad one, maybe immoral. You could look at that from another way, though, and look at what the hydroelectric dam produces. It provides a source of relatively clean energy to the city of Port-au-Prince. It doesn't serve all of its needs, but it certainly helps and improves the access to electricity of people there, fostering a higher quality of life, relatively speaking, and better electricity for businesses and job creation. So from that perspective, the policy that led to that dam was a good one. So policy is complex in development. It's also complex in outcome. I have two examples for this. The first involves kudzu. So speaking to folks in Maryland, I believe you know what kudzu is. It's an invasive vine that can literally take over swaths of vegetation and kind of suffocate everything that's under it. That came because of a policy decision to address soil erosion and protect agricultural and business interests across the Southeast. That being a problem, folks decided as a policy measure to bring in kudzu to maintain the soil, to keep it from eroding. Unfortunately, because of the species of kudzu is not native to that area and it had no predators to control it, it overtook vegetation in huge ways and really threatened ecosystems across the Southeast. That was an unintended outcome of a policy that was not foreseen at the time. Another example is called the cobra effect. This term comes from an economist that studied British colonial rule in a city in India, during British colonial rule in a city in India that had a problem with cobras, the snakes. The city had cobras everywhere and needed a means to eradicate them. So they passed a policy that placed a bounty on the head of every cobra that people turned in, which incentivized killing the cobras and taking them off of the streets. Unfortunately, it also incentivized cobra breeders who would raise these snakes to then kill them and turn them in for the reward. Once the authorities learned of this, they of course could not maintain, subsidizing this business. And so they ended the policy immediately, which then removed any incentive to maintain and keep cobras around. So all of these cobra breeders released their snakes back into the streets. And after the policy was implemented, the city ended up with more cobras than it had beforehand. Thus, the cobra effect. So sometimes policies can be detrimental and actually be counterproductive to what we're pursuing. All of these complexities we can navigate. We can't eliminate the risks, but we can navigate in a much more holistic, cohesive way if we're able to talk with one another, to engage across difference, to hear different perspectives from one another on these issues that are so important to our communities and around the world. So I hope you've enjoyed exploring civil discourse with me in these brief, condensed segments of our civil discourse curriculum. I hope that the activities have been fruitful for you, whether you've done those as an individual or as a small group. And I want to leave you with one particular call to action. I want to challenge you to engage in one conversation a week. It doesn't have to be long. An hour is a long conversation. It could be 10 or 15 minutes. But to engage with the conversation with someone else around a political topic that's important to you. Perhaps start with one that's less confrontational, or to believe to be less confrontational. One that you may know well, that others may know well. And practice using your tenets to guide your engagement. Practice leaning into curiosity. Practice speaking with humility, where you may not know all of the answers, but also with conviction, where you lean into what you do know. Use the definition of civil discourse to guide you as conversation to enhance understanding. Any transformation will come after that through the process, but civil discourse itself is conversation to enhance understanding. Take your time to acknowledge your values first, to learn what others' values are that undermine or underpin their positions. And keep in mind the complexities of policymaking as well, and how some issues may impact others, putting our values at times in conflict with one another. This all sounds daunting, but I really do think practicing civil discourse in this way, as I hope you will do after the program today, can help us to resolve issues within our communities, maybe even within our families and our close relationships, and move forward together in addressing the challenges of our world. Thanks.